Rob Fairlie. I'm a professor of economics at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and a research associate at the NBER. I was really interested in trying to get a handle on what's happening with COVID-19 on small business owners and trying to get some sense of what the early stage impacts were. So I've started some research projects on this issue. And just to give you a little bit of background on it, if you look around the country and also other parts of the world, stores, factories, many other businesses have closed, either by policy mandate, downward demand shifts, health concerns, or other factors. And one of the things that we don't really know much about right now is what are the early effects of COVID-19 through these channels on small businesses and entrepreneurs. The problem is that it's hard to find data. It's very hard to find timely data on small business owners, on business ownership in general, or entrepreneurs. And so I wanted to look at a project where I answer three questions. The first is, how large are the early stage impacts of COVID-19 on small business owners? The second is, were there disproportionate effects on female, minority, and immigrant business owners? And what contributed to the disproportionate effects, if there are any? So what I tried to do is try to figure out what's the most timely data that I can get on this, that within a reasonable amount of time, I could get some evidence that was useful. And so I've done a lot of research with the current population survey. And the current population survey has questions on business ownership, in addition to what most labor economists work on with it is the unemployment rate and also labor force participation. The CPS is great. They're large samples. Each monthly survey has about 130,000 people in it. It has a very rapid release. So the April 2020 microdata covers the week capturing April 15th and was released on May 13th. So it's released less than a month after kind of the midpoint of the capture date. It captures all business owners, so that includes unincorporated business owners, incorporated business owners, non-employer and employers. So all types are included, which is very useful. And then one of the key things is it includes active business owners. So those individuals who are currently running their business and working in that business. One thing we don't know is if those are temporary closures or permanent closures. And that's something that we're not going to know for a while in any case. Just to give a very rough and quick timeline on what's been happening. So March 11th was a key date. The World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic. March 16th, San Francisco Bay Area was the first to impose shelter-in-place restrictions that were very extensive. March 19th, the state of California followed. The next day, New York State followed. And then very quickly, a lot of other states followed. And by early April, most states had some kind of social distancing restrictions in place. Now, if you look at a graph of business ownership over time, so here I'm graphing from January 2000 to April 2020, over this period of time, you can see business ownership is pretty stable. There are certainly some kind of longer term patterns that are slow moving. Even when you look at the Great Recession, over the entire Great Recession, there was only a 5% drop in the number of active owned businesses. It really just doesn't change that much. And that's because of demand and supply factors kind of canceling each other out. But what you see is this dramatic shift downward in April 2020. It's dramatic, it's clear, it is undoubtedly a break from trend. Now let's look at it closer. So if we look at just any business owner who worked in the survey week, we see a 22% drop in April. I'm going to compare all the numbers to February. The March data has some small effects from what was happening, but clearly, the timeline that I just showed you, April was the first month where we saw, a clear full month of social distancing restrictions. So everything I'm going to do is mostly comparing February to April, and then I'll show numbers for May and June, which are also available now. If I condition on working 15 or more hours, which is roughly 2 days a week, you see a 28% drop, so an even larger drop. And then if you condition on working 30 hours or more per week, you see an even bigger effect of 31%. If you just focus on hours, so hours worked among active business owners, what you see is almost a 30% drop. Unincorporated businesses showed a 34% drop from February to April. And even incorporated businesses, which we tend to think of as more successful, more growth-oriented, they also showed a 20% drop in a 2-month period. Again, all of these numbers, these drops are unprecedented. Even in the Great Recession, we only saw a 5% drop overall, and that was over a 1.5 year period of time instead of a 2-month period of time. Now, one of the things I was most interested in was how this differs by demographic group. What we see when we look at business ownership and the success of businesses is extreme inequality in terms of outcomes. So we typically see that female business ownership rates are much lower. African American, Latinx business ownership rates are lower. Immigrant businesses typically have higher business rates, but often lower, success rates in terms of, revenues, profits, survival rates. So here I'm looking at female versus male. Female business owners did see a disproportionate drop in the number of active business owners, a drop of 25% compared to 20% for men. When we look at this by race, major race and ethnic groups, what we see is African Americans were hit the hardest. So 41% of active business owners who were Black shut down, essentially, at least temporarily, maybe permanently, from February to April. So that's unprecedented. It's extremely alarming. And I'll come back and talk a bit about that number a little bit more later on. Latinx also experienced a disproportionate impact of 32%, and Asian business owners 26%. So all of these were higher than the national average of 22%. Immigrant businesses also took a big hit in business activity over this period of time. 36% of immigrant business owners were inactive relative to February. And you can see, comparing that to US born or native, there was only an 18% drop, which was still large, but in terms of percentage points, there was a disproportionate one. Now, this also translates into unemployment because a lot of minority-owned businesses hire co-ethnics. And so one of the things that I looked at in another project with Ken Couch and Hunan Xu is looked at unemployment rates. And what we found is huge increases in unemployment for African Americans and Latinx over this 2-month window also. So those two are related. Obviously a lot of jobs that Blacks and Latinx have are not in those businesses because they're such a small number, but it does have implications, and that's another factor that I wanted to talk about later on. There were also some interesting patterns by industry. Some of the industries hit the hardest were personal and laundry services. So I found a 79% drop in the number of active businesses over this period of time. Arts, leisure, hotels, huge drop, 35% decrease. Construction was also hit pretty hard, 27% drop from February to April in the number of active business owners. Now, how do these industries affect the racial, female and immigrant patterns that I showed you before? The ones I've highlighted in yellow here are the ones where industry does explain part of what's going on. So female business owners, their drop from February to April was partly because of the industries that they're concentrated in. Same for African Americans, same for Latinx, and same for Asian-owned businesses. Not so much true though for immigrant businesses. So even though they're concentrated in different industries, it's turned out to pretty much be a wash from at least from February to April. Was there a rebound in May and June? So as I mentioned earlier, the May and June data from the CPS are now available. I looked at both of those in kind of a separate follow-up paper. And what you see is there is a rebound. There is a rebound in May and then a continued rebound in June. So looking at that graph a little more carefully here, this is just the number of active business owners conditioning on any work in the previous week. So you see the 22% drop in April. The drop from February to May is 15%. So there was a 7 percentage point rebound based on February levels, and then another 7 percentage point rebound in June. So if you look at June relative to February, now we're talking about an 8% drop over that period of time. It's true for all demographic groups. So you can see the rebound for male business owners. You can see the rebound for African American, Latinx, Asian. One thing that's a little bit hidden here in this graph is that for African American and Latinx, there's still, both of these groups still have representation that's much lower. The rebound was large, but still it put them at lower levels relative to February than non-minorities. Immigrants also saw a rebound over this period of time, but again, we see disproportionate impacts if you're going to measure the losses from June relative to February overall. So what are some of the conclusions from this project that I worked on? One thing that I found is there's a large drop in the number of business owners in April. There were certainly disproportionate effects on female, minority, and immigrant businesses. This is problematic because each of these groups had levels of business ownership that were lower prior to this period of time. The loss of 41% of active Black business owners is especially troubling, right? This is a group that has low levels of wealth, low levels of business ownership to begin with, and even if you condition on business ownership, less successful businesses. There was a partial rebound in May and June for all groups. I also found that pretty consistently across industries. Most industries also found a rebound. One of the issues, though, that I think is really important here is that there's lost business income in each of these months. So even if there is a rebound, when you still see, a 10, 15 percentage point drop 2 months later, that's a lot of lost income. I'm also measuring this as active business ownership, so that conditions on any work activity. So if, say, your business is running because you're active in that business, but your revenues could be down 80%, right? That's one thing you can't measure with the CPS data is there's no information on income or revenues. So it's something to keep in mind that all of these losses are going to be much bigger when we think of them as income. And that's going to translate into longer run inequality. As I mentioned before, there's also job losses for co-ethnics. So there's a fair amount of research showing, for example, that Black-owned businesses are more likely to hire African-American employees, right? Those jobs are often in those communities, they're local jobs, and they're important jobs. And, that's going to have another impact. This summer, we're seeing that COVID cases are going up. So we also have to be very careful about that. And I'm not trying to make any kind of judgment on whether or not these rebounds are a good thing or bad thing. I'm just trying to be objective and show, what's actually happening. One of the things that is worrisome is the disproportionate impact on different groups, especially among African-American businesses. The policy response specifically to small businesses losses, one of the biggest programs is the PPP loans that the government has spent over $600 billion on. Obviously, the stimulus checks have been important. They're not targeted towards small business owners, but they've also helped some small business owners stay afloat. And then private firms and foundations have kind of stepped up. There have been a number of really interesting ones. So for example, Magic Johnson has put money towards Black-owned businesses. Beyonce even has a new set of money that she's selling a song that she's putting the proceeds to help Black-owned businesses. Foundations are stepping up their efforts. PayPal has a new program. Facebook has a new program out there. Google also has another commitment to help small businesses. It seems to be that almost every day there's some new company that's coming in and trying to figure out a way to help. So those are all good signs. There's also been a lot of interest in the Senate. I noticed that there were at least 2 or 3 different Senate testimonies that have talked about the numbers that I've just presented that I created from the CPS. And the numbers have also been used for the Buy Black movement. So there's been a lot of interest in shopping at small businesses, shopping local. So California has a new sort of shop local, shop smart initiative going on, but there are also ones that are specifically targeted towards Black-owned businesses, where there are lists that have been pushed around on Instagram, for example, showing which Black businesses are in your local area. And so that's also been a really interesting movement. And all of these things are somewhat unprecedented, right? There have been smaller movements in the past, but we've never seen anything like this in the past.